Hello, everybody. Welcome to this town hall at Central Bank of Chile. This is also live on YouTube for anybody else that wants to see this and is not present. We're very happy to have Gita Gopinath. We are honored to have her here. I think since 2019 that you hadn't been in the Central Bank and in Chile. Gita is the first Deputy Managing Director of the IMF. Before that, she was the IMF's chief economist, and she was also professor of international economics at Harvard. It's really wonderful to have you here, Gita. Yeah. So we are on the back of the spring meetings, the publication of the WIO, and it seems that it's fairly grim out there. So could you start by laying out sort of the state of the global economy?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, I've come on now. So firstly, thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here at the Central Bank of Chile, and I've been here a few times, last time in 2019. So in terms of the state of the global economy, we put out our most recent forecast in April, where we have growth for this year lower than last year. So we have growth was 3.4% last year. It's coming down to 2.8%, and then we have a slight recovery to 3.3% next year. And if you look at where the slowing of growth is coming from, it's coming from advanced economies as group. So around 90% of advanced economies are projected to have lower growth this year than they had last year. On the other hand, emerging and developing economies as a group have actually higher growth projected for this year compared to last year. And one big country that is playing an important role in that is China. It's basically the reopening in China that's, where we have growth for them at 5.2%, and that's playing an important part. If you look further ahead into the medium term, we have growth slowing to around 3%. So it's about 3% 5 years out, which is one of the lowest it's been in a very long time. It used to be, if you looked at 2011 and looked at the 5-year ahead forecast, it was around 4.6%, and now it's 3%, the 5-year ahead forecast. So overall, weaker growth, and weaker growth that's expected to persist into the medium term. The other big indicator that everybody is, of course, following is inflation. And I think it's fair to say that inflation everywhere, on the positive side, is coming down. It peaked sometime last year, and it's coming down, headline inflation especially. But if you look at core inflation and the kind of underlying inflationary pressures, that remains fairly sticky in many parts of the world. And that is a challenge. This is the year when everybody expects that central banks are going to get much closer to their targets. But if you look at our forecasts for several countries, you don't get to your inflation target before the end of 2024 and even into 2025. So that is a big challenge that we face in an environment where you have the risk of what we call geoeconomic fragmentation, climate risks, financial sector risks. We saw some developments in the US recently and in Switzerland. But this is kind of, I would say, some of the few broad indicators for the global outlook.
So we have low growth, we have high inflation. Obviously, one needs to wonder how it came to be that we're in this situation. What explains these prospects? And then how can policymakers deal with this? What is the view from the IMF on what explains this phenomenon that we're seeing now of low growth and high inflation, and what would be the policymakers' approach to solving these issues?
Well, I mean, some of the slow growth, at least in the near term, is coming from tightening policies which are required to bring down inflation. So the fact that we have a much tighter monetary policy stance with real interest rates having gone up quite significantly in many countries of the world, the fact that fiscal policy is also tightening, as should be the case, given the inflationary pressures, we have tighter policy, which is, of course, causing a demand to go down. Second factor, of course, is the shocks that we've had in the past, including the higher energy prices, have affected countries that some of the residual effect of that is still bearing down. The war in Ukraine is not over. So many of these factors play a role. If you look into why growth is weak in the medium term, which is the 5-year out, I mean, just mechanically, it's coming because China's growth is slowing down. So we have China's growth going down to around 3.5% in the medium term, which is much lower than it used to be in the past. Now, that's to be expected. I mean, China has done a lot of convergence. At some point, its growth will slow. But China suffers from a couple of issues which is more broad-based around the world. One is demographics. Aging populations is one factor. The second factor is weakness in productivity growth. And that remains a challenge for countries around the world. So in terms of what policymakers need to do, I mean, I think firstly, squarely, you have to address the inflation issue. That's absolutely critical. You need macro stability to get to high levels of growth. Fiscal policy should be supportive. It should help the most vulnerable in society, but overall the fiscal stance should be restrictive to support bringing down inflation. And for productivity, structural reforms, preventing disorderly fragmentation in the world, green investments, digital investments, I mean, these will be required. How are you seeing the outlook in Chile, and even in terms of the near-term and longer-term potential growth, and what do you think is needed?
So for the long term, I think it's interesting to see that as economists, we need to be a bit humble. There are things we know. We know that an open economy works. We know that the rule of law, strong institutions are really important for long-term growth. But when you go to the details on what specific policies to implement to achieve higher productivity growth or more innovation or human capital accumulation, we know way less of how to design this specifically. Now, at the central bank, I think the set of challenges is a bit, quote unquote, maybe easier in terms of the diagnosis, because as you say, inflation is an issue. Maybe we know a bit more about how to deal with that, restore macroeconomic balances, restore a pace of expansion of demand that is consistent with stable inflation. And if we don't achieve that, I think it's very hard to think about the long term. So focusing on macroeconomic stabilization in the short end, I think is really crucial for at least give the space to think about long-term growth. Now the scenario is, as you mentioned, is not very good, right? Low growth, high inflation. But there are even more risks around the baseline. And that's probably something that the IMF takes a look at. So how do you see the main risks around this baseline forecast that we have now?
First, I would say that it's not clear whether inflation is going to come down as projected by many of us. I mean, the markets, I think, are particularly optimistic, but even our forecasts are for inflation to come down around the world. But if you look at the data that's been coming in, it still shows relatively strong labor markets in many countries. So while we do expect monetary policy work with a lag and that the effects will show up, I think one of the big risks is that more may be needed, more than what anybody expects at this point in terms of tighter policies. That is one important risk to our forecast. And the reason that could be particularly complicated is because of the spillovers to the financial sector. As we saw, for instance, in the US in March, you can see that as interest rates go up, you might see more financial stress. In a sense, it's a bit surprising that we haven't seen more stress than we've experienced right now in the financial sector. But again, I think that is one of the big risks. As of now, we believe that interest rates should be used to bring inflation down, and you have financial stability tools to address financial risks. But that nice separation can become much more complicated, and you can have bigger trade-offs when you're entering a zone where you could actually have a more systemic financial event. So that, I think, is another important downside risk. A third risk is, again, the war isn't over. we could see effects on energy markets. We could see energy prices going up again. That's not in the baseline, but it is a risk. And in terms of looking ahead and other risks that we face, climate disasters remain as a very important risk. What we call geoeconomic fragmentation, which is that political tensions is leading to decoupling in trade across countries. These are additional risks to the baseline. So our medium-term growth forecast of 3% 5 years out does not include the effect of geoeconomic fragmentation, which is why this remains an important downside risk.
Mm-hmm. And the financial instability, some of us that went through the 2008, 2009 great financial crisis and all the recession that happened at the time, when you see these jitters in the banking system, it's inevitable a bit to think back and say, are we going ahead in terms of facing another major systemic event, such as what we saw in 2008? What do you think are the differences of what we see now with back then? Is there anything preordained in terms of moving forward towards a major event?
No, what we've seen so far is very different from what we saw during the GFC. What we saw, for instance, in the US was an outcome of interest rate risk. What we saw in 2007, 2008 was what I would call credit risk, right? Losses, credit losses. So this time around, it's been banks that have short-term deposits that they've then invested in long-term treasury bills. And we've seen those treasury bill prices fall a lot as interest rates went up. And very poor internal risk management, along with poor supervision and regulation, generated the risk where you had basically a bank run. And a bank run that was supercharged by technology and social media. So for very large scale. In the GFC, it was more the standard where the loans that banks made turned sour, credit losses that they earned, right? That came from the housing sector. Now, we're not seeing that because we've seen much stronger economies now than it was back there in 2008. We're not seeing a credit loss event. Second, if you look at why the downturn lasted so long in 2008 was what we call a balance sheet recession, which is balance sheets were weakened as housing prices fell, and that had a long-lasting effect. We don't have that with balance sheets at this point. And importantly, the banking sector, the regulated banking sector, is in a much stronger position than it was back then. So we don't expect to see anything inevitable that the financial stress events that we've seen will necessarily end up in a bad place, because this is very different. I would say that banks are in a much sounder place than they were back then. And how do you see it here in Chile?
So obviously that's something that we monitor. We have a financial stability report coming soon. But I think there are three issues that are worth mentioning. One is that we know from experience that when the Fed has these hiking cycles, some tensions appear somewhere. And it's good to have that frame of mind, saying that as the Fed was hiking and the ECB was hiking, some tensions would appear, and therefore we need to have a framework of policy and a direction of policy that was in some way cognizant of that feature. We started hiking earlier. We started hiking in 2021. And that means that when all these financial tensions started to occur, we already had concluded our hiking cycle, which I think put us in a good position, given that we have a credible framework for inflation targeting, a flexible exchange rate, and it has been absorbed very well in that sense. Now, also structurally, our banking system is quite traditional. It has a traditional business model. The balance sheets are easy to see or to interpret. Mm-hmm. We don't have that many banks, so the job for the supervisor is also somewhat easier than in other places. And I think that also has helped a lot to not see any type of these troubles that we've experienced elsewhere here in Chile. You mentioned inflation inertia before. So why has it been so sticky in the world? Because inflation is a global phenomenon. But not only is a global phenomenon, but it has been high in many places, and it seems to take a while to go down. Why do you think that is the case?
Yeah, I think that is the million-dollar question, by the way. If one was doing research at this time, I think that is a question that one should really dig into. I don't think we have firm answers yet, but I'm going to put some suspects on the table, and that is, that's as far as one can go at this point. So firstly, we have a whole population, households and firms, that came out of the pandemic with strong balance sheets. Now, part of it was that forced savings that they had to do. Second was very strong fiscal and monetary policy support, and especially large amounts of transfers in many countries that helped people strengthen their saving balances. Several households paid down their debt. So in general, balance sheets are in a stronger position, which supports higher consumption and reduces some of the sensitivity to the rising interest rates. Second is you have this pent-up demand, which came from the reopening, which has had quite a long effect. And you're seeing that pent-up demand now show up in the services sector, which is where you're seeing a lot of the sticky inflation. As we know, services demand tends to be less interest sensitive than demand for goods, especially durable goods. And so that could be another reason why we've somehow, the interest channel has become a little softer. Then if you look at supply side factors, it's taken a while for supply side shocks to wear out, right? I mean, if you look at the supply chain disruptions and so on, and then you had the big increase in energy prices, all of that has only now started coming off. And so maybe that has delayed the pressures on inflation. There is an argument to be made that potential output could be weaker at this time in the world following the pandemic, and that could also be putting inflationary pressures up. But all said, I think we are far more concerned about inflation being much more stickier and the upside risks to inflation than anything you see in the market at this time, which I guess is why I worry about that as being a downside risk. How would you say in Chile, what would you see as the factors for keeping it sticky?
The first thing is that we have a long history of inflation, like many other places in Latin America. We have high inflation for many decades, quite volatile. And this meant that although the economy never really dollarized on the transaction side, we really did see an increase in or an entrenchment of inertial price setting, of indexation, and that seemed to be a very common feature across the economy for a long time. Interestingly, this is not something that is fixed. So when we started inflation targeting in 2000, alongside with a flexible exchange rate, what you perceive is a reduction in the inertia of inflation because of the credibility of the inflation target. Also, you see a reduction in the pass-through from exchange rates to prices, which is a bit the same phenomenon. So I think we started from a good position to face this very large demand and supply shocks that increased inflation. But in spite of this, we were concerned. We were concerned when we were at the peak of inflation last year that maybe these indexation processes might be getting a bit of a boost and that inflation would have a harder time coming down. My view, or our view, that we've developed over doing the forecasting and seeing the recent evolution of inflation is that there doesn't seem to have been a major shift back to higher indexation or stickiness in inflation. And going forward, our forecast is that inflation goes back to the target, to 3%, by the beginning of 2025. And essentially, there are three things that work towards that. One is the gradual normalization of, let's say, the demand side pressures. The fact that we had high consumption for a long time, that should start to continue to normalize over time. Second, the fact that expected inflation also came back to 3%. For a while, it was a bit higher. Now it's back to 3%. That also should help. And third, the persistence of the previous shocks also starts to wear off at the same time as the supply shocks are also in some way dissipating, and we have actually a strengthening of the exchange rate, lower supply chain disruptions, and things like that. So I think those are the main factors that help us construct this view that inflation should go back to 3%.
I think you're right that it remains the case that there is a lot of credibility on monetary policy, which is why around the world inflation expectations remain quite anchored, right? I mean, everybody expects inflation to come back down to close to the, or if not at, the central bank's target. So that credibility is there, which is why it's very important at this time to get the job done, to keep on to that credibility.
There has to be delivery, right?
Yes.
Otherwise, promises are not enough. Now, the fund has been moving into different areas, and for instance, earlier this year, we had a workshop with the NBR, and Pierre Olivier was here, and he talked about the different work strands regarding geopolitical or geostrategic fragmentation, which is something that you mentioned in your previous remarks. So how do you see that as a risk for the world economy? What are the main challenges that are associated with fragmentation, either on the geopolitical side, trade fragmentation, and things like that?
Yes. So, I mean, we have to put this in context first, which is countries are coming out of the pandemic when the supply chains were disrupted. And I think an even bigger event was Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which has triggered a lot of concern about economic security and national security around the world. So I think it's a perfectly reasonable thing for countries to want to build greater resilience, as opposed to the hyper-efficiency that was there from the 1980s to before the pandemic, or maybe a little bit before the pandemic, when the whole idea was that you just source your inputs from the cheapest location, and it doesn't matter if you're doing 100% of your sourcing from that particular origin, because that's the cheapest place to do it. I think everybody now feels like that is a riskier strategy. And you need to build resilience, which means you need to diversify where you buy from. I think that is perfectly good, which is, you have diversification. Yes, it's likely to increase your costs by some amount, but it's the right thing to do in the kind of the newer world that we live in. What we are concerned about, though, is that in the guise of economic security and national security, that you might end up with what is effectively protectionist policies for gaining economic advantage. And that is a slippery slope, right? Even with the best of intentions, countries may be doing this for diversification reasons, for national security reasons, but it's because we don't have the guardrails to prevent this from expanding much more substantially, that this could end up with much greater fragmentation. And so we have simulations that show that if you have trade fragmentation, a very strong decoupling of trade around the world, then you could end up with global GDP being about 7% lower on a permanent basis, which is like losing the economies of France and Germany on a permanent basis. So it could be very substantial. And if you put on top of that technological decoupling, which is, by the way, already going on, but you see much more stronger form of technology decoupling, then that cost goes up more substantially. Now, there are scenarios where you could have some fragmentation, for instance, less reliance, for instance, on exports from Russia, which has a much more minuscule impact on global trade. So I guess the long story short is that you do want to put sufficient guardrails to make sure that we don't end up having completely abandoned all the gains we got from all the integration we had over the last decades. And it's particularly costlier for smaller economies that are more open, that rely more on international trade.
No, indeed. For Chile, for instance, being a smaller economy with not a lot of diversification that is open to finance and to trade with the whole world, fragmentation would be pretty bad. Mm-hmm. And maybe those magnitudes that you mentioned in terms of contraction of output, they are quite dramatic, and for a country like Chile, that would be quite a bad scenario. And this is obviously a global challenge. Talking about another big global challenge, which is climate change. Mm-hmm. All the international institutions are looking at this. Central banks are looking at this. What is the approach that the IMF is taking in terms of climate change?
Yes, I mean, firstly, it's very impressive what Chile as a whole is doing on the issue of climate change, both the finance side, but also the central bank, all of the initiatives that are there. And this is absolutely critical. So the International Monetary Fund is a part of this because we see this as macro critical, which is why we are a part of this dialogue. And we work on all the fronts, which is on climate mitigation, climate adaptation, and also on the transition towards a greener economy. So for instance, on the climate mitigation front, we work on providing policy advice on which policies are more likely to be able to get the transition going. We have been proponents of carbon pricing, carbon taxes. I mean, Chile is one of the few countries in Latin America that to put a carbon tax, which we think is really essential to get the transition to happen. And also in terms of what kinds of regulations are needed to make the transition happen. So that's one big part. What kind of a carbon price would be needed? Those are the kinds of analysis that we do. On the adaptation front, we're also helping countries in terms of the need for infrastructure investment, the greener investment. We have a new tool that's called the Climate Public Investment Management Assessment Tool, which is basically what helps countries figure out which kinds of climate investment projects are better and which are worse. So this is a new tool that we've put together. We also are into the risks of the impact on the financial sector of having this transition, when you have brown assets, the risks to your system, also just climate disasters and events of that kind on the financial sector. And lastly, we very recently have now a new lending facility called the Resilience and Sustainability Trust. It's longer-term lending that we're giving for countries to be able to invest in building resilience to climate change, but also in terms of climate mitigation, so that they're on a much more sounder macro footing. We've had several countries already access this facility. In Chile, I know, as I said, that there's a lot being done. If you could say some more about how the central bank is looking at the green transition.
I think that what the central bank, what we do is within the scope of what the country is doing. And as you mentioned, there's a lot of things going on. Part of them because there's a willingness to accept that this is a big challenge at the national level. So there's an agreement that this is something that we should work towards mitigating and facing. There's a second element that we have the comparative advantage. As economists, we know the importance of comparative advantage. We have copper, we have lithium, wind, water, sun. So everything sort of lays out in a situation where, for instance, currently solar and wind generation are a very significant part of total generation of electricity. There are explicit targets of this should be continue to increase to around 60% by the end of the decade and going carbon neutral by 2050. So the elements of the comparative advantage are there, which I think is very critical. There are a number of legal frameworks that also help this in terms of limiting emissions, helping with energy efficiency, green financing, which is also something that you mentioned. And as a central bank, we are also active on this, on the NGFS. We are actually co-chairs of the modeling subgroup that attempts to view what are the effects of climate change on the macro. We have an active research agenda on this. And some of you know, but I wanted to also mention it, that this year our annual research conference will be focused on climate change because, as you mentioned, there are some areas that clearly are macro critical. So this is something that is part of our work stream, and we want to pursue it further. Later in a few weeks, we are also co-organizing the Green Swan conference with the BIS, which also considers issues of finance and macro impacts of climate change. So with this, I think we have some time for questions from the audience. I believe there's a microphone if somebody wants to raise a question.
Hello. Hi. So I have a question regarding the US dollars. So we have seen the debt of the US very high in the latest time and still increasing. So, do you expect the US dollar to keep being the safe haven for international capitals when uncertainty increases? Or do you see any scenario in which the US dollar loses that property? And if so, which ones?
It loses the property of having a reserve currency and the dominant currency of the world?
Yes.
Ah. So, more generally, I mean, I'm going to, yes, the US debt has been high, and we're all hoping and expecting that the whole debt ceiling issue is not an issue for much longer. In terms of the question of the dollar's role in the international space, so it is the dominant reserve currency. It used to be around 70% of world reserves in 1999. It's come down to slightly under 60%. But it still remains dominant. And if you look at where the diversification has happened, it's gone not to the euro and to the yen, but actually it's gone mainly to smaller, high interest paying currencies like the New Zealand dollar. Would be one such currency where you've seen the demand shift to. There's been some shift to the renminbi, but only 25% of a shift to the renminbi. So the renminbi share stays very small. Question is how its staying power. I mean, the main thing is, as we know, and this is what history has taught us, is that to be a dominant currency, firstly, you have to have highly liquid markets, full financial convertibility, strong institutions, and all of this so far, if you look at, in terms of what the US dollar provides, it just remains dominant. Second, we know that network effects play a very important role, and the dominant currency in international trade and international finance is, again, the dollar. So there's a tendency for people to accumulate the dollar. So I would say, as of now, there's no clear sense that in the near future there's going to be a change in the importance of the dollar. Yes, I think there are going to be fringe countries that are going to switch to maybe other currencies and so on, but that's going to be on the margin and not the big story.
Thanks. Another question on the back there.
Thank you. I have a question about the link between the labor market and inflation. So in advanced economies, the labor market has been persistently tight, whereas in emerging countries such as Chile, it has been showing signs of slackness. Inflation, however, has been similarly persistent in both groups. So my question is, why is it that different labor market outcomes are not more highly correlated with inflation? Is it that the link between the labor market and inflation is weaker than commonly thought? Or is it that these groups of countries are facing other different forces that result in a similar inflation outcome? Thank you.
Thank you. I actually would say, looking at the cross-country sample, that for many countries, the labor market is actually, I would say, strong. And I'm going to ask Pablo to come in about Chile, but my reading of Chile is that it is, I would say, it's a pretty robust labor market at this point. So you're seeing a lot of jobs being posted compared to where interest rates are. These are fairly strong labor markets. So I think the question actually is, but why are we not seeing more softness in labor markets? And this goes back to the answer to the question on why is inflation so sticky, and I think it's because demand has remained high. Consumption spending is softening, but it still remains high around the world, and again, corporate balance sheets are in a good position. So that's one factor. The second factor is that we had a decline in labor force participation that came right around the time of the pandemic and for some time after the pandemic. And we're only slowly seeing people come back. In the US now, actually, prime age workers are back. Labor force participation of prime age workers are back to the pre-pandemic trend. So it does return. And that dynamic has had an effect on the tightness of the labor market. Certain sectors like hospitality and retail, especially, had a harder time getting workers, even though demand came back very strongly. So I do think those are, for me, I think that's kind of what I see as a more broad-based story. Now, there are, of course, individual countries where wage indexation plays a bigger role than in other countries. And that could be one reason why, even if there is some slackness in the labor market, you can end up with wage negotiations leading to high wage pressures and therefore to higher inflation. That's one factor. There are, of course, structural differences across countries in terms of the labor market. So you can have structurally higher levels of unemployment, which, policy is not going to be, simple monetary policy is not going to be able to change. But how would you describe labor markets in Chile?
No, I think that it's a fair question to ask, and you mentioned it, why as the macroeconomy slows down, the effect on the labor market has been relatively muted in terms of unemployment or even job growth. And one view is that we've discovered that there are other margins of adjustment. For instance, at least in our case, job openings have adjusted much more rapidly. Real wages have been contracting. So maybe you have a scenario in which part of the effect of the slowdown of the economy with high inflation on the labor market is not through higher unemployment necessarily, but rather through more contraction in real wages, lower job openings, as you mentioned, maybe higher participation, and that smooths out the effect on unemployment itself and job growth, which probably is good news, because that's probably the least efficient margin of adjustment when you have an economy that is slowing down. Mm-hmm. There's another question on the back.
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me? Yeah. So staying on the topic, perhaps my question is about the outlook for labor markets in the next years, decades. I was wondering how you see things like automation and new technologies such as AI or new ways of working, such as remote work, or even geopolitical tensions will affect the evolution of labor markets. Should we expect, for instance, job polarization now affecting also skilled labor of specific industries? And in that context, what do you think is the role for public policy? Thank you.
So I think that is another very important research question, which is how is AI going to affect the economy broadly, labor markets in particular. We don't have all the answers yet because it's moving so rapidly. So if you look at generative AI, which is something like ChatGPT and so on, what the impact of that is, I've seen studies where actually the jobs that are getting affected or the tasks that are getting affected are the more higher skilled tasks. People used to do the more higher skilled tasks as opposed to on the lower end. So in a sense that it could actually be less polarizing as we see it. Now, this is not the first time we've had technological changes that have disrupted labor markets. And what we've known traditionally is that it tends to raise overall productivity. So the expectation is that, again, AI, we can see that. I don't know if I'm sure all of us have played with GPT, and you can see how it can raise productivity. You can see how you can actually see that happen. So I think there is a good reason to assume that this is, again, one of those technologies that will grow the pie. I know I've seen some studies that also say maybe it could go the other way, but I'd like to think that with productivity going up, you can actually grow the pie. But then again, then the distributional consequences come in, as always, when you look at technological change. And since transitions take time, in terms of people who don't have the right skills, having to have the right skills, you can have disruption in the labor markets in the short term. But again, we've seen this movie before, so we have to make sure we don't make the same mistakes again. I think it's very important to not assume that people will costlessly adjust and pick up the right skills on their own and somehow find the jobs that are available. There is a period of mismatch, so it's important for policy to be supportive on that front. It's also important for policies to make sure that you're not biasing take-up of AI relative to workers, because in one case, you're subject to capital taxes, which are lower in many countries than labor taxes are. So you need to make sure the tax policy is also not generating a bias in that direction. But I'm just going to end by saying that, frankly, we need to know a whole lot more about this particular technology. And it this time could be different, so I don't want to assume everything is going to play out the exact same way. But we should pay very close attention to it. How do you think, Pablo?
So, as you say, this is something that we've seen before. And maybe one approach is to say, what is the degree of substitution versus complementarities that these technologies provide to the labor force? And how those differ according to the skill level. So it can be quite complicated matrix between substitution and complementarity, high skill, low skill. It could be the case that for low skill workers, this helps them a lot in certain tasks. And it substitutes some high skill coding work, for instance. Now it's much easier to do. And then looking at the longer term, what we can see simply looking at the history is that the nature of work changes. The nature of the tasks that humans that we end up doing is very endogenous to the tools that we have available, to the technology that we have available. So maybe we'll adapt. And but as you mentioned, it's also very critical to have a sharp eye on potential mismatches in the short run that can create problems that then create pockets of let's say lower skilled or lower incomes that affect certain segments of society that can have quite detrimental effects. So I think we have time for one last question.
Hi, my question is regarding the fiscal outlook, in the sense that after the COVID pandemic, there was generally a drop in fiscal income and an increase in spending needs that resulted in generally a global rise in fiscal debt, and that in many countries they are still above pre-pandemic level. So my question is about your assessment on the feasibility of maintaining this debt level, and or the risks and challenges that will face potential fiscal vulnerabilities, or what will happen if they are forced to do fiscal consolidation. And relatedly, do you see some risk regarding this subject on the persistently higher interest rates?
Thank you. So debt went up sharply in 2020 because of all the support packages that were provided, which were quite substantial. And of course, in several countries, you had deep recessions. But I think the support that was provided was an important part of the higher debt levels. Now, since the peak the debt levels reached, which was closer to around 100% of GDP, this is global debt to GDP, public debt to GDP, was around 100%. Because of inflation, that shaved off around 7 to 8 percentage points. So debt to GDP now is around 92%. That's still about 7 percentage points above what it was pre-pandemic. Importantly, if you look at our projections for debt going forward, for the major economies, especially the US and China, you actually see that debt continues, debt to GDP is projected to continue to rise given all the spendings that are projected to happen. Our advice is that there are two reasons why it's very critical for governments around the world to tighten fiscal policy and to help bring down debt levels. One is the fact that debt levels are really high. This is not the last shock. There's going to be other shocks that come in the future. So you need to be able to have the resources to do it. And we saw that countries that had greater resources were able to do much more in the pandemic. So that's one reason, is that you want to be able to consolidate, given that you have much higher debt levels, and you have to plan for the future. The second is all of these countries have high levels of inflation. So you don't want your fiscal policy to be pro-cyclical at this time. So that's another reason why you want to have fiscal consolidation. So it is, our advice is it's important for countries to bring debt levels down. For low-income countries, we have several of them in deep debt distress. So the number we give is around 60% are either already in distress, which means they already have defaulted, or in high risk of debt distress. About 25% of emerging markets are in that category. For them, what we need at this point, given the very high levels of debt that they need debt restructuring. It's not going to come through increasing growth and revenues. So they need debt restructuring. And the international financial architecture never had something to provide debt restructuring on a very efficient basis. We have a much more complex creditor landscape too. Now, the G20's common framework was the solution that was put in place to be able to help countries restructure their debt. And that was very important progress. I think we should recognize it. Now, that said, it's a process that's taking a lot of time. So we need to improve the efficiency of the process, try to get it moving faster. And that's what everybody's working together on to try and make happen. At the IMF, we, along with the World Bank and India's G20 presidency, created a global sovereign debt roundtable that brings together all the creditors, official creditors, private creditors, but also the debtor countries to come together to see how we can improve the process so that it can work much better.
Thank you, Gita. I think I totally agree that the effect of inflation on the debt burden doesn't mean that you can use inflation to ease the fiscal burden. And that, if anything, the last 20 years teach us is that the shocks come from the most unexpected areas, and you need to be always ready with your buffers up and prepared to respond. So with that, thank you very much. Thanks all for coming. And, Stephanie, please.
Yep, it's the microphone.
I wanted to ask, what are the distributional impacts of inflationary convergence? Who has paid or will pay for the inflationary adjustment? Is it via markups or via marginal costs? And if it is via marginal costs, what role does wage adjustment play versus price adjustment of intermediate inputs, such as imported goods? And finally, how do you see this depends on monetary policy strategy and labor market regulations? Thank you.
That's a very good question, which is how do we see, who's bearing the effect of the inflation? So we looked at this historically, and I can compare what we're seeing now relative to history. So we looked at past episodes of periods of high inflation and monetary policy trying to bring inflation down. What always happens is you first have a period when real wages fall. And we've seen that happen this time too, which is wage adjustment is slower than price adjustment, so the real wages fall. If you compare to the historical averages, actually, real wages have fallen more than it did in previous episodes, like, for instance, when the US was tightening interest rates in the 1970s. But then what you do see is real wages start catching up, and they tend to return to pre-pandemic levels. And we're beginning to see that in countries now, including signs in the US, that wage growth is now exceeding price inflation. So you actually see real wages go up, right? I think what this also tells you is that just because wages are going up faster than prices doesn't mean you have a wage price spiral. It's the natural adjustment process. At some point, you should expect to see wages go up relative to price inflation, and that's what brings back real wages. So that's what's happened historically, and if it follows that path, we should expect to see real wages going up from around, where now in many countries. The one concern, of course, is that because real wages have fallen so much, we might see much more persistence in the wage increase and the catch-up. It could take longer, which is then I start worrying about inflation expectations de-anchoring and that affecting the wage dynamics. But more generally, there is scope. We've seen that in many countries. Corporate profits are quite high. There is scope for wages to go up without prices going up because you absorb that in markups. And that would be the kind of natural way for this to happen. More generally, for the impact on the labor market, of course, structural reforms in the labor market are a very important part of how you have higher real wages and higher productivity.
Thank you. Okay, so with that, again, thanks all for coming. Thanks all for the very interesting questions, and thank you, Gita, for being here and sharing your views on all these very interesting topics on macro.
No, thank you. Thank you so much, and it was a real pleasure to have this conversation with you and everybody here, and thank you for your very insightful comments.
There you go.